All right, welcome to our 1 p.m. Eastern Time session featuring Neil Musante on the subject of C.C. Wright medals, more specifically the Wright and Bale years. C.C. Wright was a prominent 19th century American medalist and engraver, and Neil, following his copious study of the Washington pieces, has now started working on C.C. Wright, and I believe is in the process of developing a C.C. Wright catalog and researching everything about individual Wright pieces. So with that, I will hand it off to Neil and we'll get started.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks, Len. Thanks for inviting me to talk. And as Len said, the Washington project led me into studying the work of C.C. Wright. I just became fascinated with his work, really based on the Washington medals. And lately, I've been working on this project for a while, and I have been bogged down in the years that he spent in partnership with James Bale. So the story leading into this partnership is that a die sinker by the name of Richard Trested came over to America in early 1820. He was up and running by the time the 1820 New York Directory was out, and Trested was apparently doing work for Scoville as a die sinker. By 1824, Scoville had the ability to roll out planchets and brass planchets, and they began to issue tokens and things of that nature as early as 1824, believe it or not. And by 1829, Richard Trested injured himself. He amputated his finger somehow and died shortly thereafter from the infection that it caused. And in 1829, probably in May, C.C. Wright bought the contents of his workshop, took over his lease on William Street, and employed Trested's apprentice, James Bale, as a partner. He also employed another apprentice by the name of Frederick B. Smith. So the three of them, Wright, Bale, and Smith. Smith was very young at the time. Went into partnership. Smith wasn't really a partner, but he was definitely a part of the organization. And they began to issue medals, tokens, and political tokens. And so I'm going to cruise through the medals here fairly quickly because they're fairly self-explanatory, easy to understand generally. But one of the first ones I think that's confused numismatists for a long time is this medal of George Washington. This is the first variety. The reverse on this is different from the reverse on the second variety. But this little newspaper snippet shows that the medal had been created as the first in a series of planned medals of all the presidents of the United States. For whatever reason, that series never came together and never took off. And the medal was not struck in any large quantities. Interestingly, though, he decided to use the medal as an award medal. So the medal on the far left was used as an award for the American Academy of Design, or the National Academy of Design. And then the one in the middle was an 1830 exhibition that Wright did for the National Academy of Design. And it's kind of interesting because what it is a blank planchet on which a head that has been cut out from one of the original medals has been adhered. It's probably soldered on, and then the blank is reversed, or the blank reverse is blank. But the interesting thing about this medal is that he wanted to do a presentation at the exhibition, but because this medal is signed W and B, Wright and Bale, he decided to cut it out so that the signature didn't appear, Bale's signature didn't appear on the medal. It is an extremely interesting piece, and there are only two of them known. And this medal here on the right simply shows the stage of the head being reversed. They probably ground off the back of the medal to make it thinner before they cut it out. By the way, the head is copied after the Vivier bust of 1818, the series Numismatica. So I want to jump ahead to the Astor medal. Now, this is an unsigned medal, but it is clearly the work of C.C. Wright. And I say that because by 1830 or 31, when this medal was struck, there was nobody in the New York area doing this quality of work. In Philadelphia, you had Gobrecht and First, who would have had the ability to do this quality of work. But we have a little piece of evidence that'll show that it came from the Wright and Bale shop. When you look at the reverse and you see the crossed calumets and the peace pipes, that reverse was used on another Indian peace medal that Bauman Belden wrote about in the 1940s, I believe. And here you see that C.C. Wright head adhered to a medal with a reverse that matches the reverse of the Astor medal. So that would be one piece of evidence to show that this came out of the Wright and Bale shop. A further piece would be this Lafayette medal, which we know to be the work of James Bale, signed, where he also cut out the head, adhered it to a planchet, and used that reverse from the Astor peace medal. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that if you size these proportionally and overlay them on the reverse of either one of these Astor medals, the one in the middle, they match perfectly. They're identical. They line up perfectly. So there's no question it's the same die. One other comment I'll make about the Astor medal, by the way, is that by 1831, when this medal was struck, Astor was in his 70s and looking to sell the American Fur Company, which he did in 1834. So this portrait was made much earlier. So Wright was working from a portrait, and it was probably a drawing by his friend Henry Inman. Henry Inman was a well-known artist who had apprenticed with a fellow named James Jarvis, and Jarvis was the painter who did a portrait of Astor in the very early 1800s, probably around 1808. And so this is probably from when Astor was in his 50s. Anyway, jumping forward, Wright liked this medal so much. By the way, you can occasionally find these cutout heads in the marketplace. This is probably cut, the copper one is probably cut from a metal. The silver one, I believe, is cast. But then the metals were cast. So they're the planchets that the metals were struck on were cast. So it is conceivable that this is also a cutout. But in any event, he used, many years later in the 1840s, he used it as an award medal for the Brooklyn Institution. And that would be this medal here on the left. This medal here on the right, I'm not sure what it is. It's at the Smithsonian. Whoops, how did I do that? And let me back up a minute. And it matches the setting, the bezel matches the James Bale Lafayette medal. So again, another piece of evidence that these all emanated from the Wright and Bale shop. 1830, Louis Philippe became the king of France, and so they issued a fairly rare token or medal with the busts of Louis Philippe and Lafayette. And the portraits on this are very good, but the date is executed rather poorly. If you read the medal around, Louis Philippe, first king of the French, and the date 1830. But then they elected to put November 25th facing the other way. And I think the medal probably failed for that reason, that just appears upside down. It's a small point. It's a rare medal, and not easy to find. Later, they did, in 1834, they did a little tribute medal to Lafayette when he died. Lafayette died in May 20th, 1834. And I suspect that this medal was struck right at the very end of the Wright and Bale partnership, that their partnership lasted for 5 years, and 1834 marked the end of their partnership. They did, however, remain friends and helpers throughout the entire course of, how do I keep doing this? There we go. Through the entire course of C.C. Wright's life. This is a medal he did in 1831 to exhibit at the National Academy of Design. It's a bust of DeWitt Clinton based on an engraving of Clinton made by his former partner, Asher B. Durand. These two horticultural medals are typical examples of Wright and Bale for that period, but they're rare. They're both very scarce and tough to come by. They don't appear very often at auction. It's just interesting work. Later, they jumped, they did the school medal for the Boston Gift of Franklin school medals. And the medal at the left was the earliest one that they did. And this was presented as early as 1831. By 1833, there was a problem with the reverse die. So they needed a reverse die. And rather than go back to Wright and Bale, who no longer exist, well, I guess they did exist. Yeah, still in 1833. But rather than go back to Wright and Bale, they hired a local Boston die sinker by the name of Stimson. And they created this new reverse, which is basically a copy of the old reverse. And then in 1845, they created yet another version. But the three obverses are all the original obverse by Wright and Bale and are all signed. And again, the three of these are actually difficult to find. I won't say that they're rare. I think the medal on the left, the 1831 medal, probably in the neighborhood of 70 were struck over a period of 2 years. How many of these survived, though, seems very uncertain. It does not appear at auction very often. This in the middle, many more were struck in the hundreds. And does seem to come up a little more frequently, but again, not as frequently as you would think. And the one on the right, same story. So in 1834, he did a great medal of Edwin Forrest. It was a tribute medal, and there's only 26 of them struck in silver. And the little medal on the right is struck in lead, and it was a medal that he struck for his friend James Mapes. The reason I want you to see these medals is I want you to notice the portraits, that there's a certain quality to them that really didn't exist in the medallic output, private medallic output, prior to Wright and Bale. Yes, Gorbrecht was doing great work, and First was doing great work, but a lot of their work was for the U.S. Mint on larger planchets. And of the private makers, C.C. Wright, I think, kind of stood alone at that time. The store cards are another story. In a paper titled Reminiscences of Some Old New York Die Sinkers that Andrew Zabriskie read before the American Numismatic Society, he made the statement that it is greatly to be regretted that many cards, although bearing in their workmanship strong proof that they were made by Messrs. Wright and Bale, have yet nothing to identify them as such, and as no record of the emissions from the workshop of this firm seems to have been preserved, it is extremely doubtful whether any light can be thrown upon the subject. So I kind of took that as a challenge, and so I thought I would like to try to identify some of the tokens made by the Wright Bale shop that are not signed by them. In order to do this, I kind of took the following approach. I wanted to consider the fabric, the look, and the feel of the metal or the token. I wanted to see if I could find some letter punch or other type of punch linkage. And then I wanted to see whatever other evidence I could find to show that the metal might have been struck in the period that they were active or in some way had emanated from their shop. So the first thing is that we hear the concept of fabric, look, and feel. This is something that I think I first learned of this through Tony Terranova. I think Tony once discussed this with me, and it was early on in my collecting days, and I guess I really had no clue what he was talking about at first, but then later I found a kind of a reference to fabric in C. Willis's Betts book on colonial metals, and I began to think about it. So whenever I look at a token or a coin or a metal, I try to think if the fabric makes sense for the period. And the fabric seems to me to be fairly understandable. You know, it's the metal that the planchet is made out of. Does it have a consistent color with other work that we know to be of a particular maker? Does the weight make sense? Does the type of metal used, for example, if in this type of token, they were seldom struck in silver, but they were often silvered. So you want to take things like that into consideration. So I think fabric is fairly easy to comprehend. The next thing is the look of the metal. And for me, that's many of the design elements and the quality of the workmanship. And in the case of Wright and Bale, for example, almost all of their store cards, with the exception of the first two, which I'm not showing here, but all of them have denticles around the rim, or sometimes both beads and denticles around the rim. One thing that I noticed that Wright and Bale did a lot is they used a superscript letter in an abbreviation, often with a dot or a dash below. So if you look here, you can see on this Doremus, Soydam, and Nixon token, where you have the superscript O with a little dash below it. Here you have it with no dash as a variety. The T has the little dash below it. Now, that was a fairly common technique used among engravers. And first and foremost, C.C. Wright was an engraver. He was a prolific engraver, in fact, and he was an excellent engraver. I think indeed he could rival the work of Asher B. Durand, with whom he was partners. Now, Durand may have exceeded him in that work, but I think it's because C.C. Wright's heart did not necessarily lie in engraving. I think that he wanted to move on from that and practice something else, as did Asher Durand. Asher Durand became a very well-known landscape painter in his later years. But this use of the superscript letter is just one thing that you might look for in terms of trying to identify where a token or metal came from. The workmanship, the central design elements, does the portrait or the device on the token look worthy of the individual we're considering, in this case, C.C. Wright? And so I think fabric and look are fairly easy to comprehend. But then there's the feel. This is where where it becomes very difficult to put into words why a token feels like it came from their shop. This was really first written about C. Willis Betts, but I was reading Jim Rosen and Jack Howes and Gary Trudgeon's book not too long ago, and it struck me in their introduction that the art of understanding the fabric of a coin is an intangible characteristic, but is important to the understanding of the coin. And I truly believe that's true, that having the ability to hold these in your hand and study them over time, especially if you have the opportunity to see a lot of this material, you will begin to develop a feel for whether it's authentic or fake or cast or fabrication, or could it possibly be real? So in putting together the next few slides, I wanted to make a determination based on three things. The fabric look and feel that I've just described. The second thing I wanted to look at is letter punch linkage or other punch linkage. And the third would be some piece of evidence, something other than just looking at the metal, that might tell us if it makes sense that that token might have emanated from their shop. So letter punch linkage. Gee, it would be wonderful if you, so here's what I've done. I've taken a token and I've sized them identically, tokens that I want to match up. So in this case, we have Soydem and Nixon, 3 different varieties. And what I wanted to do was size them identically, the same number of pixels per inch, the same diameter, 27 millimeters or 26.5 millimeters, whatever it might be. And then I fade one of the images, as you can see here, and I lay it over the other image and line up the letters to see if they line up, to see if I can identify defects in the punches or things of that nature. And I think that this takes us a long way toward linking it to a particular shop, but it's definitely not definitive. I wish it were, but die sinkers could move from shop to shop and take their tools with them. Tools were available from overseas. They could be purchased in London and shipped over to America, so that it is not inconceivable that multiple die sinkers had the same set of punches. On some of the punches, though, particularly on early tokens, the letters were not fully formed. They might be a piece of a letter that are pieced together. So you look for all these evidences and clues, and you try to come up with something that at least matches with a very high percentage of accuracy. And in this case, you know, I think 95%, you know, well, that was an arbitrary number, but it's a pretty high percentage. So, so what I wanted was to find letter punch linkage. And the other thing I would point out is that type makers in America in 1830, there were only 8 type makers in America. They were located in the major cities. I think there were 3 in New York, 4 or 5 in Baltimore, and a couple in Philadelphia. But type is usually cast and not, you know, hardened steel cut into the end of a punch. So it's unlikely that type makers, I think, were making letter punches of this type for die sinkers. So either they had to make their own tools, or they had purchased them from other die sinkers from other parts of the world, specifically, though, London, I would say. So letter punch linkage, important, very important, but not definitive. So taking the Doremus, Soydem, and Nixon token, this became a model for me to use in attempting to identify many of the other tokens. And 3 of them are unsigned. One of them is signed, the one farther on the right, Wright and Bale. but the unsigned ones line up, the letters in the names line up, the cinquefoil lines up, the numbers 209 on all of the medals line up. I think it's a very safe bet that all of the unsigned Doremus, Sudheim, and Nixon tokens were struck by Wright and Bale. So one other point on this that I would make is that I guess Roulau had theorized that the earliest ones might have been struck by Trested, but when you study the directories for New York for that period, the firm was at 171 Broadway and moved to 209 Pearl Street in 1831. So that was right in the period of the Wright and Bale partnership. So that's what I mean by a third piece of evidence. Outside of looking at the token and the metal, having the directory evidence that shows that they moved in 1831 is pretty good evidence to show that these were probably Wright and Bale shots. Now, I believe that the Feuchtwanger store card shown here is also a Wright and Bale production, unsigned, but he makes his first appearance in the directory of 1831 at 377 Broadway. Before that, he's not in the directory at all. And what would be the more opportune time than when you move to bring out a token? And, you know, I did some letter punch matches, and they line up very, very nicely. I don't think there's anything terribly distinctive here to say definitively that these letters are a match, but there's a little thinness here. And again, they line up when you line them up on top of each other. I mean, they match perfectly. There's a little bit of a, what's the word? A tilt, an upswing on the R. And so all of these little things combined, I'm inclined, plus the workmanship and the cinquefoils, which match, by the way. So I like Wright and Bale for this Feuchtwanger token. I also like them for the Squire and Merritt token. There are three different varieties of this token that I've noticed so far. There may be others, but again, 1831, right in the wheelhouse of Wright and Bale's partnership, they moved to 175 South Street. And again, the letter punches line up. And when we look at the fabric or the color, the shape, the size of this metal, they compare extremely nicely to this copper Sudheim and Nixon piece. And again, the Sudheim and Nixon is the token that I use to do the letter comparison on this piece. C.H. Webb, Congress Hall. Again, when you look at that metal, it has the same look and feel as this Doremus, Sudheim, and Nixon. So, and again, letter punches line up pretty well. So I like Wright and Bale for the Congress Hall medal by C.H. Webb. Beck's Public Baths. I think Dave Schenkman discovered that he established this business in 1832. And again, I have letter punch matches and to both Congress Hall and Sudheim and Nixon. So again, I like, plus the central figure. When you look at that figure, I asked the question, who else was capable of doing something that nice or that decent? You know, it's not great art, I get that, but it's so superior to anything that had preceded it that that I really think that it has to be the work of C.C. Wright. And of course, probably unsigned. They probably in that period wouldn't want to sign a token with a picture of a naked lady on it. So in now we're going to move on to political tokens a little bit. In the 1990s, Wesley Cox did a lot of, I don't know Wesley or who he is or was, but he did a lot of letter punch studies that Rulau wrote about in one of his catalogs, and he was able to link the oak leaf punches on the reverse of this Jackson token to the oak leaf punches on the reverse of one of the first Wright and Bale store cards. And again, when you line them up and impose the photographs over each other, they really do line up. They really do match. So I think that that's one piece of the puzzle. One other piece of the puzzle, though, even perhaps more important, is let's take a look at the Jackson tokens that existed prior to 1832. And here are the tokens of 1824. And look at these portraits. They're pretty dreadful. I mean, I actually like them because they're so dreadful, but they're cartoonish. And moving on to 1828. Again, look at the portraits of Jackson on these 1828 medals, and they're just terrible. And then if we move to 1832, we've got a couple of portraits here that I believe are believed from the shop of Robert Lovett, who is now active in New York by then, Robert Lovett Sr. But here's all of a sudden this portrait of Jackson that is so far superior to what has come before. And here's a portrait done at the Mint. Probably this is by Gorbrecht. I mean, I don't know who else at the Mint could have done this, but you have two decent portraits here. One of them definitely from the Mint, and the other from a private maker. But the rest of these private maker tokens are not that great. I would say that these two tokens, these are placed in 1828 by DeWitt. It is now believed that they were actually struck for the 1832 election. But again, you have kind of a higher quality of effort here. The eagle is superior in many ways. The Jackson on a horse, the horse is really well executed. And here I just again show the portraits and what a difference that Jackson portrait is. Moving forward to 1832, we've got Henry Clay in 1832, and this is definitely a C.C. Wright portrait. It is signed by him. This one is not signed, but I actually believe this one, 1828-1, HC-1, is again by Wright and Bale. These other two, 1832-2 and 1832 HC-3, are attributed to C.C. Wright, but I don't think they are by him. I think that they are copies actually made at a later date, probably in the 1840s. Again, in 1832, Henry Clay, there was the very start of the Whig Party, the very beginning. Henry Clay would have been seen as an advocate for the American system, but by 1840s, he would be the champion of republicanism and the American system. And then when you look at the lettering on the reverse of this other one, 1832, it really looks like it's a much later period, probably from the 1840s. So I like C.C. Wright for these rare Jackson pieces and this rare Henry Clay. I would also point out that in 1832, there were not that many portraits of Henry Clay generally available to copy. Now, 2 or 3 paintings existed of Henry Clay as a young man, but they were not widely engraved or easily obtainable until Henry Clay achieved a lot more fame by the middle 1830s, 1834. Now, finally, I like C.C. Wright for the 1834 glorious Whig victory token. I like him because the fabric, the look, and the feel of the token. I can do letter punch linkages with the Soydam and Nixon and with the Robert Ruggles gold beater token, the unsigned one. And then finally, when I look at the artistry of the metal, that Liberty cap was probably copied from a Mexican coin of the period. And it's just a nice, I think, quality piece of work. The ship is a little more primitive, a little more comical, I guess. But I think the letter punch linkage, the ship, and then one other piece of evidence that I'll offer. In 1834, I guess Martin Van Buren was elected. It was a midterm. It was between terms. And the Great Whig victory, you might argue, did not exist. The Whigs didn't win the governorship of New York. They didn't win the mayoral race of New York City. They lost that race by something like 57 votes or something like that. But what the Whigs did accomplish is that 15 of the 17 aldermen in the city of New York were all Whigs. And so they considered that a great Whig victory. 1834 was a very violent election in New York. There were riots. People tried to prevent the Whigs from voting. There was a group of Navy men who carried a replica of the USS Constitution, the ship, up and down the street, trying to encourage voters to get out and vote and save your Constitution, using the ship as a symbol for the Constitution. And they were put upon and attacked and beaten, and it got pretty bloody. I think the police had to be called out, half of whom were not on the side of the Whigs. So it was a pretty ugly, ugly day. And they still ended up with 15 of the 17 alderman seats. So they felt that it was a great Whig victory. Charles Cushing Wright was extremely active at the birth of the Whig Party in New York. He was very active. His name appears several times in the newspaper as an attendee to their meetings. And in fact, he was a delegate to their convention in Utica in 1834. So his connection to the Whig Party, the workmanship, the letter punch linkage, and the overall look and feel of the thing have me convinced that this came out of their shop. And there are some of the, just for the hell of it, I put up some of the letter punches to show just how remarkably similar they are. And again, what happens when you overlay these is that they just merge beautifully. It's really remarkable. So, oh, no more slides. I must be done. So I will be happy to answer any questions or.
All right, we've got a few questions here, so we'll jump into them. First one, this one's going to be tough, but we'll see how you do.
Okay.
Is there a metal book or a reference catalog website that goes into more detail for beginners in collecting metals?
Well, I think that there are a lot of really excellent books on that, but if you're a beginner, maybe you might want to start with Dave Bowers's book on the 100, Dave Bowers and Katie Jager's book on the 100 greatest metals. It'll just give you an overview of, what collectors are interested in. And from that, you can probably branch out. I mean, the field is limitless. So that might be a good one to start with, but any catalog, I mean, despite the fact that, all of us make mistakes in our books, they're stepping stones to the next book, basically, where more accurate information is to be found. But why not Russ Rulow's catalogs on early store cards. I think it's a fine place to begin. So.
Yeah, the 100 Greatest book is a really great overview, and if you just go on Amazon and search for 100 Greatest Metals, it should pop up. Mark Jones' book, The Art of the Metal, is also quite good, maybe more for art metals. But yeah, the 100 Greatest is and it's an inexpensive book. It's doesn't cost a lot, so it's a good choice. All right, next question. How valuable are most of these silver metals? That was earlier in the presentation, so maybe some of those pieces.
Right. Well, let me start with this metal right here in silver. This came out of the Baker collection not long ago. It's the only one known in silver. So how valuable is it? It's actually probably pretty valuable. I mean, to my point of view, it's got a lot going for it. It's got George Washington. It's made by C.C. Wright. It's early America. So I think for a lot of reasons, but it's not the highest quality of a metal ever struck. It's a cast planchet. Back then, C.C. Wright didn't have the ability to get rolled silver planchets at about 2 inches in diameter. So not quite 2 inches, but it's struck on a cast planchet. But what is it worth? Multiple thousands. I don't know, maybe 8,000-10,000. I don't know. I do know the aster metal though is pretty untouchable. I think the one on the left, which I think is silver, I think in the $30,000 to $40,000 range, if I'm not mistaken. These are expensive metals, but you know, when you get into things like the Brooklyn Institute metal or some of these others, I think they're more valuable because we're now beginning to understand what they are. But school medals in general, or award medals in general, don't seem to command the premiums that historical medals command. So, you know, I'd put this in several $1,000s, the silver ones, bronze ones perhaps less. So here's a small silver medal though that's actually fairly common. So you might find this medal for in the $500 to $600, $700 range. But yeah, I don't know. I hope that answers your question. When they show up in a Stax Bowers auction, that's when we find out, or Heritage, that's when we find out how much they're really worth.
Yeah,
So,
you know, I guess that some of these pieces are so infrequently traded that
yeah,
it's really an art to set a price on them, and you kind of don't know until it goes on the auction block, and you know, until that happens, just nobody knows. It's just kind of a wild guess.
right. But I would also say the entry level, like if you get interested in hard times tokens, and many of the Wright and Bale tokens appear in the quote unquote hard times category, although I think that that's not a properly titled category for the metals and tokens. But in any event, the store cards, the entry level is pretty steep these days. The interest in it has increased. And I think to have a decent one that you'd want to have in your collection, you're probably looking at, you know, $150 to $300. And the rarer metals go in the thousands of dollars. And so you can collect in the hard times series in the lower range if you're buying well circulated examples. And by the way, I don't think there's anything wrong with collecting well circulated examples, because these things traded as money. There was always coin shortage and copper shortage, and having these tokens trade at the value of a cent or a half cent, depending on their thickness, shows that they circulated, that they were carried by people, that they meant something when they were in circulation. So I think collecting circulated pieces is is a worthy undertaking. I would also point out that many of the hard times tokens were restruck in the 1860s and 70s. And a lot of the uncirculated pieces that exist are probably restrikes from a later period. So anyway.
All right, next question. That's pretty good. Did letter punches have square handles to help align the letter?
You know, I have no idea. The only letter punches I've actually ever really seen were the property of John Adams Bolin, and he was a die sinker from the 1860s, so much later than this period. And they were formed at the end of a long, slender piece of steel. Like they probably had a steel rod, maybe a 1/4 inch, and they would he would carve the letter in the tip and then taper the tip down to the letter so that they could hammer with it. Those are the only punches I've ever actually seen. So I don't think I can answer your question intelligently.
Yeah, it seems like if you had a long piece like that, it would be really likely to slip. So they must have had some way of, sort of fixing it in place.
Probably. I hadn't thought about it. Yeah, but probably.
All right, next question. For the gift of Franklin medal, you said the 1831 Wright Bale obverse was matched with another firm's reverse in 1833 and 1845. How did they do that? Was it common for a firm like Wright and Bale would give dies to the customer that would enable them to take the dies to somebody else?
So yes, the answer to that is yes. Back in the day when Wright and Bale were working, the customer owned the dies. So the dies would be transferred to that customer. So by 1831, or in 1831, let's say Wright and Bale struck the made the dies probably to the tune of $300 or $400 for the pair. And the dies, after an initial order for metals was shipped, the dies would also be given to, in this case, the Boston School Committee, I believe. And then in 1833, when they needed a new die, I suspect they probably took them to this local guy, Stimson, who was able to recreate a die to the proper size. And then, but yeah, they still possessed the obverse die. So by 1845, Wright and Bale didn't exist, so they would have had to go somewhere else anyway. So
yeah, and then at the ANA, we talked about that Franklin Peel token with the cracked die that somehow got mated much later with the Washington piece. And so you just had this scrap die with a big crack in it floating around somewhere.
And was the Washington, remind me, that piece was a George Hamden Lovett piece?
It was the GW 263.
Okay.
I know you know all the numbers.
I have it memorized. Yeah. No, I'll look that up to figure out which one it was. But as I recall, I think that might have been a George Hamden Lovett piece. And anybody who knows and is studying tokens and metals should have pity on Dave Baldwin, because he's undertaken the Lovetts and it's never ending. George Hamden Lovett never met a die he couldn't marry with something else. He was nuts.
All right, next question. I know you've published some of the Wright material in the MCA advisory. Are you working on a book or a longer monograph on the subject?
Yeah, I am, and the book is reaching completion. I've really taken my time with it because I want it to be as good as I can possibly make it. But I figured now is the time to begin to start sharing some of the information. So recently I did a little article in the TAMS Journal, and then I put something into the advisory, and now this presentation here. And most of this will get more deeply discussed in the book form. And the book is probably going to take the form of an electronic book this time. I think I'm going to do it as an ebook, and we'll see how that goes. So.
Okay. Next question. The Lafayette medal you showed by Wright looks very similar to the Conwa medal. Is Wright's medal, a copy of it, is Wright's example signed?
So um, let's go back to the James Bale. This is definitely a copy of the Conway medal, without any question. In 1824, the story is that that Lafayette visited America in 1824. While he was in America, an artist by the name of Ari Scheffer, who lived in Paris, had painted a full-length portrait of Lafayette with this bust and shipped it to America, and it arrived in America in 1825, January of 1825, shortly before Lafayette sailed back to Paris. Along with the portrait, Scheffer shipped over a supply of the Conway medal that had been struck at the Paris Mint, I assume. And the portrait went on display very briefly in New York at the American, oh God, my brain just went dead. The American, well, the American Art Institute or whatever it was called. I'll think of it in a minute. And then it went on to Washington to its final destination, which was the U.S. Capitol. It was a gift from Scheffer to the United States government. But while it was in New York, those medals were distributed, and there is no question that James Bale, Richard Trested, created copies of the Conway medal. This is Bale's versions. Trested's is a little bit smaller, and you can read about it if you'd like in the article that I did in the Thames Journal. I think that was published in May. And anyway, yeah, there's no question. Now, Wright, did he copy the Conway portrait? Yeah, I think he did. I think he decided that was the most definitive portrait. But if you look at this portrait enlarged and blown up, it's really superior to, I'm sorry, to the James Bale one. And James Bale's portrait is not bad. This portrait is not bad. Where'd it go? I lost it. But I do think that the Wright portrait, that miniature Wright portrait, is one of the best. It's very superior. And Wright also did, back in 1824, Wright also did several other little, before, this was while he was in partnership, believe it or not, with Asher Durand and Cyrus Durand. He did a medalette of Lafayette with a miniature portrait that is also very good. Very different from this, though.
All right. I'll give everyone another minute to enter any final questions. Do you have another topic in the background once you finish off with the right stuff that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I've decided that I'm going to write a bestseller that's going to be turned into a movie, so that I can make $1 gazillion and become a Hollywood fat cat. You know?
Okay. All right.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. A little sarcasm there. I probably am not going to take on another topic. It's just.
Oh,
I don't know. We'll see.
You're a curious person, so I don't think you can help yourself, actually.
We'll see.
So, all right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Neil, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Len, very much.
All right. See you later.
Bye-bye.